Regulatory Saturation Part 2. It's August 28th, 2026. Welcome to YesToHellWith.com. In honor of Dolly Parton, I'm wearing pink as per my publicist's request. Thank you for everything, Dolly. Now, in Part 1, we gave a name to something most Americans experience but rarely see as a whole, and that is regulatory saturation. Today, I want to explain why it is so difficult to recognize, because almost every regulation can be made to look reasonable when examined by itself. Your grass cannot exceed a certain height. Why? Community standards. Your house numbers must be a certain size. Why? Emergency services. You need a permit for a shed. Why? Safety. You cannot park a vehicle in a particular place. Why? Traffic and public access. You need a license to perform a particular occupation. Why? Consumer protection. You cannot use your property in a particular way. Why? Zoning. Taken individually, there is almost always an explanation. And that is the trap, because the citizen experiences these rules collectively. Consider one ordinary person. He wakes up in a house regulated by building codes, zoning ordinances, property maintenance requirements, fire codes, utility rules, and taxation. He gets into a vehicle that must be titled, registered, inspected, where required, insured, and operated according to hundreds of traffic rules. He drives to a business operating under zoning requirements, occupational regulations, tax requirements, employment laws, safety rules, and licensing provisions. He earns money subject to another enormous body of law. He buys food regulated from production to packaging to sale. He returns home to property whose use may be restricted by still another collection of laws and ordinances. And tomorrow, he does it again. Here is the important point. No single regulation creates regulatory saturation. Accumulation of those regulations and laws and ordinances does. Imagine a room. Place one piece of string across the room. Nobody would call it a web. Add another, still no web. Now add hundreds and thousands crossing one another. Federal, state, county, municipal, administrative. Eventually the character of the room changes. And yet if I show you only one string at a time, you may never understand what has happened to the room. That is exactly how we usually discuss regulation. Someone complains about zoning, we discuss zoning. Someone complains about licensing, we discuss. Someone complains about tax regulation, discussion. Then there's building codes, discussion. We divide the web back into individual strands and then ask whether each strand can be justified. But there is another question. What is the cumulative effect of all the strands together? That question matters because freedom is not experienced one regulation at a time. Neither is government. You experience the cumulative boundaries placed around your choices, and something subtle can happen when enough boundaries accumulate. The citizen begins asking, am I allowed to do this? Think about that question. Not, does government possess lawful authority to prohibit this? But am I allowed? That is a profound change in the relationship between the citizen and government, because the traditional premise of American liberty is not that government grants us every freedom we possess. Government possesses enumerated or otherwise constitutionally limited recognized powers, depending upon the level of government, and those powers have boundaries. Yet regulatory saturation can psychologically reverse that relationship. When regulations surround virtually every activity, government begins to appear unlimited and liberty begins to appear exceptional. You may build this if permitted, operate this business if licensed, use your property this way if allowed, place this structure here if authorized. And after generations of living inside that system, we stop noticing the premise underneath it. We simply ask, what do I need to do to get permission? That does not mean permits are inherently unlawful. It does not mean zoning is inherently unconstitutional. It does not mean government cannot regulate conduct. Those would be conclusions. And the Liberty Dialogues teaches us not to begin with conclusions. We begin with questions. So here is the question regulatory saturation forces us to confront. At what point does the accumulation of individually justified restrictions fundamentally change the relationship between government and the governed? That is the question almost nobody asks. And there is another. When an official approaches you and says you are violating Section 12.47, what happens next? Most people immediately argue Section 12.47, but the Liberty Dialogue's approach begins earlier. What authority permits that section to exist? Who enacted it? What power was delegated? What are the jurisdictional limits of that power? What facts trigger its application? What status brings this person or property within its reach? What procedural protections are required? And have those things actually been demonstrated? Again, the existence of the rule is not the end of the inquiry. It is the beginning. And that distinction becomes increasingly important as regulatory saturation grows, because the denser the regulatory web becomes, the easier it is to assume that somewhere inside thousands of pages of statutes, ordinances, regulations, definitions, and codes, there must be authority for whatever government is doing. And eventually the citizen stops asking government to demonstrate that authority. He assumes it. That may be the greatest danger of regulatory saturation. Not simply the number of regulations, not simply the inconvenience, not simply the cost, but the presumption created by their accumulation and the acceptance by citizens that it is so. Government regulates virtually everything, therefore government must possess authority over virtually everything. Those are not the same proposition. And in the next session, we're going to bring this out of the abstract and walk into perhaps the most revealing place in America to see regulatory saturation operating, and that is on your own property. Because if you want to understand how large the regulatory web has become, start with something you believe belongs to you. Start with your home. And as always, may truth reign supreme.